Um, With that, we will begin today's Superintendent's Budget Advisory Task Force meeting. Today is June 12th, and what we are going to be doing today is reviewing the district's proposed 23-24 budget. And I won't go too far into the detail of that process because I'm certain our finance team and our Director of Budget Audit and Attendance, Mr. Arcala, will review the state budget cycle and the requirements for the district to adopt our budget and the idiosyncrasies of how those are not naturally aligned within the state of California. So with that, we will begin the presentation of our 23-24 proposed budget. I will say that this will come to our board on Wednesday night for its first review and public hearing. It will come back at the second meeting in June for a second review, public hearing, and potential approval. With that, Director Arcala, why don't you take it away and begin our budget presentation, please?
Sounds good. Thank you, Superintendent Kamick. So today we have our proposed budget report for 23-24. Next slide, please. And so for our agenda today, this is a roadmap. We'll be providing friendly reminders about the adopted budget process, and then we'll provide major highlights from the May revise. Afterwards, we'll discuss how we project to end the year with our estimated actuals for 22-23, and then we'll go into our proposed budget for 23-24 and look at this, and then look into the subsequent years for our multi-year projections. And finally, we'll discuss our other funds and next steps. Next slide, please. As a friendly reminder, today or at the board meeting, we're going to be holding a public hearing on the proposed budget, and we'll return on June 28th to ask the board to formally adopt the budget for 23-24. Now, here's our May revised takeaways. So please note, we did not include the 8.22% COLA from the May revise due to the late release time of our May revise and our new LCFF calculator. The May revise was released in middle of May, and the new LCFF calculator came out on May 25th. However, we start our adopted budget process in March. So in addition, the raises for 23-24 are tied to the state-funded COLA, which creates complexities with our salary model, which is part of the budget process, but we will make sure to budget the difference in COLA at our 45-day budget. So the things that we did include was the 8.13% COLA and 7.13% salary raise per the governor's January budget. Once again, the 0.09% difference between 8.13 and 8.22 COLA, it'll be budgeted for revenue and the salary increases at our 45-day budget. As an additional cushion, we already set aside the 0.09% or $300,000 needed for salary raises in our ending fund balance, and we'll show that later in the presentation. Now, per the May revise, we did include the 50% reduction to discretionary block grant and the 32% reduction to the learning recovery block grant, and set aside the amounts to be cut in the restricted ending balance to make sure funds are left unspent. Next slide, please. Now on to our estimated actuals and how we project to end the current year. Now, starting with the unrestricted general fund side of the house, the major highlights were that we included the 21-22 retros and the 22-23 ongoing raises in the current year. We also had a one-time transfer of $17.3 million to Fund 17 in order to isolate our required reserves in a separate fund. These expenses plus contributions to special ed and maintenance resulted in deficit spending of $40.8 million. Now, please note, deficit spending will improve in the subsequent years as the retros and the interfund transfer are removed from the budget, but we'll discuss that also later in the presentation. The next slide, please. Now, speaking of that $40.8 million deficit spending from the previous slide, that reduces our beginning fund balance, resulting in an ending fund balance of $23.3 million for the 22-23 year. Most of the ending fund balance is placed under our assigned category for various priorities, and we'll be going over that list in the next slide. So we project to end the current year with our 3% reserves in Fund 17, meeting our state requirement of 2%, plus our board policy of an additional 1%. We also meet our 10% reserve cap from the state after adding our Fund 17 plus our Fund 1 assigned categories. Altogether, our total reserves plus assigned ending balance equals to 6.9% or $37.8 million. Next slide, please. Now, here are the details of our assigned ending fund balance in Fund 1 and 17. So as you can see here, we have $3 million apiece for our assigned for our replaced transportation vehicles, technology refresh, and textbook adoptions. And then we also set aside 22 for 22-23 LCAP carryover. We project to have some $1.5 million unspent. And then finally, we have set aside under our assigned category deficit spending of $10.4 million, and we'll be needing those dollars in the subsequent years as we talk about our MYP later in the slides. And last but not least, for Fund 17, we have an additional cushion about $100,000 to meet our 2% state standard and 1% board policy for reserves. Next slide, please. Now we'll turn our attention to the other side of the house and drill down on our restricted / categorical funds. So here at the top, that first green arrow, we received new one-time funding. We got that discretionary block grant, $21.4 million, and our learning recovery block grant of $20.6 million. However, at May revised, there was a proposal to have those cut. So now the discretionary block grant will be $10.7 million, and the learning recovery block grant will be $14.1 million if the proposal is approved. So next, we have our expenditures, which includes our retros and raises in our salaries for certificated and classified. Now, at the bottom, you could see that we have $52.5 million in revenues over expenditures, more expenditures than revenues, and that's due mainly causing contributions, making it required for the unrestricted general fund to our restricted categorical programs, such as special ed. And that's mainly due to some unfunded mandates that's required of us and the rising costs of some specific programs. So our net increase to the ending fund balance is mainly due to unspent categorical funds, which we have set aside for plans to be spent in the future years, which we'll discuss in the MYP section. Next slide, please. Now, speaking of some spending plans for the subsequent years, these are the categorical programs in the restricted ending balance in which we'll spend in the future years. Now, out of that $47.9 million in the restricted ending balance, we have our learning recovery block grant, discretionary block grant, educator effectiveness, kitchen infrastructure and training, and other restricted local grants. So all of those programs make up the $47.9 million in the restricted ending balance. Next slide, please. Next, we'll discuss the proposed budget for 23-24. And for context, we're going to compare it to our 22-23 estimated actuals. Now, starting at the top with our unrestricted funds for 23-24, overall, the revenues increased by 5.2%. And that was mainly due to LCFF increasing based on the 8.13% COLA. And then overall, expenditures decreased by 3.9%, mainly due to reducing certificated positions due to declining enrollment, removing the one-time payment that was related to the raises for 21-22 one-time payments. And then also for our books and supplies, we decreased that due to textbook adoption costs of $5 million transferring to a discretionary block grant for 23-24. So we have some savings there. And we did not budget the one-time transfer of $17.3 million again, since that was a one-time transfer for 22-23 to isolate our reserves. And then for contributions, we did see an increase there due to rising NPA, NPS costs and special ed. And finally, we do see that deficit spending is continuing, but it is improving, going from $40.8 million to $3.7 million in 23-24. The next slide, please. And now for, oops, there we go. So now for our restricted funds. So we have our revenues, which decrease mainly due to excluding carryover for categorical programs that are subject to unearned revenue. So ultimately, we're going to include any of that after we close the books. / unaudited actuals, which takes place in the fall. And then we also included carryover in the restricted ending balance for categorical programs that are subject to ending balance that we talked about earlier. And then here we have the raises that were budgeted for the 23-24 year for certificated and classified salaries. And we're also implementing the learning recovery grant. We have 21 intervention teachers and 20 counselors, and that's part of that program. And expenditures did decrease in supplies and services. And that's mainly due to spending down our CARES Act funding. We had lots of CARES Act funding that we need to spend down because the expiration dates are coming up. And so we spent a lot of those dollars down in 22-23. And then our programs, we set aside large balances for multi-year grants and supplies during the 22-23 year. So a lot of that falls to the ending balance to be spent in the subsequent years. So at the bottom, we do see that we have deficit spending in the 23-24, but that's mainly for planned deficit spending. And that's due to budgeting for programs in which carryover is now in the restricted ending balance. So we have deficit spending in order to implement our categorical programs. Next slide, please. Now here is a summary of the combined ending fund balance for both unrestricted and restricted funds. Now our ending fund balance does decrease by $3.7 million on the unrestricted side of the house, and $15.4 million is deficit spending for the restricted funds. Now the total is $19.1 million in deficit spending, which brings our combined ending balance to $52.1 million. Now out of that $52.1 million in our ending balance, roughly $20 million of it belongs to the unrestricted side and $32 million are restricted funds. So starting at the second red arrow here, we have our unrestricted assigned, and that decreases due to deficit spending. And then for our restricted ending balance, we have planned deficit spending. And like I said before, this is due to implementing one-time categorical programs where the dollars are in the ending balance. And then for our Fund 17, we have still remaining the $16.9 million untouched, and that is to sustain our 2% state standard reserves and 1% additional for the board policy. And then finally at the bottom, we do see that total reserves plus assigned in the ending fund balance for Fund 1 and 17, they do decrease by $3.2 million, and that's due to deficit spending. And the good news, we still meet the 10% reserve cap by having 6.9% in reserves plus assigned. Next slide, please. Now here we have our 23-24 details of the ending fund balance. And once again, we see our assigned for various priorities. This is a familiar list. We have our replacement for transportation vehicles at $3 million, technology refresh, textbook adoptions also at $3 million. And then once again, our LCAP carryover is there as well of $1.5 million. And we have deficit spending, and you see that deficit spending is going down by $3.5 million. And that's where we put that money is put in the assigned section of our ending balance for deficit spending. And then finally, we have our 0.09% raise due to the difference in the 8.22% COLA. And that's roughly around $300,000 we set aside just to have an additional cushion for that upcoming expense. And then finally, our restricted ending balance, we see deficit spending of $15.4 million, once again, to implement the categorical programs. Next slide, please. Now, as we drill down further, we have the revenue assumptions and adjustments here in detail for our 23-24 budget. So for our LCFF, we have LCFF funding of $387.2 million, and that is an increase of approximately $19.5 million compared to estimated actuals, mainly due to budgeting the state-funded COLA of 8.13%. Once again, compared to May revised, which is 8.22%, we'll make sure to adjust that at 45-day. Now, the 0.09% difference, we are projecting it to be about $2.4 million more in revenue that we'll be receiving. And once that's confirmed and signed into law, we'll make sure to budget that at 45-day. And our unduplicated pupil percent, we do project an increase going from 29.44%, which is an increase of 1.49% in 23-24. Now, because of that increase in UPP percentage, we are projecting an increase of about $2 million to the supplemental grant or LCAP dollars. For enrollment, we are projecting a decline of 418 students in the next year, and ADA is projected at 94.79%, and that's based on our P2 ADA report from 22-23. So we're using that percentage for next year as well. Now, for federal revenues, we do see a decrease due to unearned budget after unaudited actuals when carryover is confirmed, and this is traditional accounting practice every year. So we'll more than likely see an increase at first interim when carryover is budgeted. Now, for our state revenues, we see a decrease due to 22-23 revenues subject to ending balance that we spoke about earlier. So we'll see revenues fall to the fund balance in 23-24, such as the discretionary block grant. For local donations, I just wanted to highlight parcel tax is projected at $4.5 million next year and is set to expire in June 30 of 2025. Next slide, please. Next, we have details for our major general fund expenditure assumptions and adjustments. So here we have our salaries. Our salaries increased based on negotiations in prior settlements for a state funded COLA less 1%. We did budget the 7.13% based on the January state budget. And in the May revised projects 8.22% like we spoke about earlier. We'll adjust it at 45-day. And we're projecting the costs of the 0.09% difference to be about $300,000. For certificated salaries, we see that it's funded by unrestricted funds, and that decreased by $6.5 million or 3.4% due to reducing staff by 24.13 FTE in order to right size the district due to declining enrollment. Now we have classified salaries funded by unrestricted funds that increased by $1.2 million, and that's mainly due to funding for due to middle schools, our new TK classes, and the kindergarten day expansion. Next, we have our contributions from the general fund to the special ed program, and that increased by $13.1 million. And that's mainly due to the MPA, MPS costs, and also for the 7.13% salary increases. The contributions in total are $88.6 million. 74.1 million is due to special ed, and the rest of it, $14.5 million, is for our routine restricted maintenance. Now, on the right side of the screen, just want to highlight PERS. PERS is set to increase by 1.31%, and we did project an assumption of 1.1% increase for supplies and services due to inflation, and then books and supplies decrease in unrestricted funds, mainly due to moving that $5 million in textbook adoptions to a discretionary block grant in 23-24. And next slide, please. This is for certificated position adjustments in 23-24. So we see an overall net reduction of 24.13 FTE for certificated positions. And that's mainly due to new FTE for, once again, our middle school conversions, our new kindergarten TK classes. And we do see a mixture of some closures here, but overall the net FTE decrease is 24.13 FTE, and that's mainly due to declining enrollment and reducing staff to right size the district. Next, we have our classified, which sees a net increase of 35.125 FTE, and that's mainly due to middle school conversions, extended day for kindergarten, and new TK classes, and several new categorical programs. So we also kept the staffing allocations for our sites the same in 23-24. So overall, we do see a net increase of 35.125 FTE. Next slide, please. Now focusing in specifically on Fund 13 or child nutrition. These are the changes for now child nutrition positions for 23-24. Child nutrition will be increasing their staff by 5.6875 FTE. And that's mainly due to a need for increased services for the free meals program. Next slide, please. Now we'll look to the subsequent years and start with our unrestricted funds for our MYP. And here are the major highlights. So At the bottom line, we see our deficit spending, which is steadily increasing by roughly $2 million each year. But starting from the top, we do see revenues for our LCFF increasing, and that's mainly due to adding in COLA. And then we have our other local revenues, which decreased by $4.5 million in 25-26, and that's due to the parcel tax expiring. So we are assuming worst case scenario, if the parcel tax expires and there's no new parcel tax, we remove that out of our budget in 25-26. And then we have our certificate and classified salaries. We see the expenses steadily decreasing as we continue to right-size the district and reduce staff due to declining enrollment. Now, supplies and services continue to increase by adding in a 1% for inflation, and books and supplies increase starting 24-25 as a contribution to textbook adoption costs return to the unrestricted general fund due to spending down that discretionary block grant. So that'll return to the unrestricted general fund starting 24-25. And then our contributions increase mainly due to rising costs of NPA MPS program. And then finally, deficit spending continues with a steady increase across the years. You can see it going from 3.7 to 5.8 to 7.6 million in deficit spending for our unrestricted general fund. Next slide, please. And now we have our unrestricted multi-year projections for our fund balance. And so our first red arrow shows that deficit spending reduces our fund balance by $6 to $7 million annually, resulting in an ending balance of $6.2 million by year 3, 25-26. And speaking of the out years, by 24-25, we are projecting our ADA to decline to less than 30,000, which triggers our required state reserves to jump from 2% to 3% starting 24-25. And as a result, in 24-25, we're starting our standard reserves for district would be 4% and adding up our new state requirement of 3% plus our board policy of 1%. So starting 24-25, it'll be a total of 4%. So the first green arrow in the middle of the table shows that we included the additional 1% reserves per board policy in Fund 1, starting in 24-25, and the 3% reserves for state standard remains in Fund 17. And the bottom line shows reserves decreasing by roughly 1% each year, and that's due to deficit spending. Next slide, please. So here we have the restricted multi-year projections. And so here we have planned deficit spending for our restricted categorical programs to continue to deficit spend in order to spend down large fund balances for one-time programs, such as a discretionary block grant and learning recovery block grant. However, by year 3, we do see the deficit spending does end, and that's because our discretionary block grant and learning recovery block grant are projected to be fully depleted by the end of 24-25. Next slide, please. Now for a restricted ending fund balance, the main point we wanted to highlight for the restricted balance is to show the set aside for potential cuts for the discretionary block grant and learning recovery block grant. We're replacing them in the restricted ending balance so they remain unspent, since the state will ultimately take these dollars back due to the May revised proposal. Next slide, please. These are the major revenue assumptions for our multi-year projections. So enrollment is projected to decrease by roughly 1,000 students and 600 students in the subsequent years for 24-25 and 25-26 respectively. We see unduplicated count. We are projecting it to increase, going to 31.14% in 24-25 and 31.84% 25-26. And the COLA projections at the bottom left, we see it's projected to be 3.94% in 24-25 and 3.29% in 25-26. Now, federal and state revenues, we projected carryover and one-time funds have been removed from the subsequent years in our multi-year projections. And our discretionary block grant will continue to support textbook adoption costs in 24-25 until the funds are fully depleted. And the learning recovery block grant will continue to fund the 21 intervention teachers and 20 counselors in 24-25 until the funds are fully depleted. For local revenues, like we spoke about earlier, parcel tax is set to expire in June 2025. And to be conservative, we project that if it's not renewed, we removed the revenues and expenditures from 25-26. Next slide, please. Now, these are the major expenditure assumptions for our MYP. Now, for supplies and services, once again, we have a 1% increase due to inflation, textbook adoption costs, increases in 24-25 as the tuition block grant is set to pretty much set to be depleted by that time. And then special ed contributions, we project to increase it by $1 million a year based on current trends. Pension contribution rates are set to increase for PERS in the subsequent years. STIRS remains the same at 19.1%. And then for 24-25 reductions, the demographer is projecting enrollment to decline by roughly 1,000 students by 24-25. So FUSD will need to adjust staffing levels to reflect enrollment at that time. And then for 25-26, enrollment is set to decline by roughly 642 students. And once again, we'll need to adjust staffing levels to reflect enrollment at that time as well. And the parcel tax is set to expire at the end of 24-25, June 2025. And once again, FUSD will have to adjust our revenues and our funded positions if a new parcel tax is not approved. Next slide, please. Now we turn our focus to our one-time restricted categorical programs funding positions. So receiving one-time funding is truly a blessing, but we must develop an exit strategy as the dollars begin to wind down. These are various one-time categorical programs funding positions that are set to expire in the upcoming years. We'll need to find a new funding source to reduce the positions, or else the salaries will be absorbed by the unrestricted general fund. However, we'll continue to monitor these programs very closely in the upcoming years and keep the board in the loop moving forward. Next slide, please. This is good news for all other funds. We are projected to end the year balanced without any contributions from the general fund in 23-24. Next slide, please. Last but not least, we have our next steps. We'll be returning on June 28th for final adoption for the proposed budget and the LCAP. And then in July, the state adopts a budget. We'll return in August for a 45-day budget revision, unaudited actuals for 22-23 in September, and then rounding out the year in December, we'll have our first interim. Thank you so much for your time. Any questions?
Thank you, Director Akala. As we give people a chance to formulate and think about some questions, I will share that just in the span of this meeting, we've got two separate updates at the state level, and that is that the legislature has announced their agreement on a budget. And that does not mean that the governor has agreed on the Assembly bill and Senate bill. But what we are seeing is that the Senate and Assembly are putting forward a budget that does not claw back as much of the one-time dollars. So we'll have to see how the negotiations happen. And as you may recall, the bill has to be in print for 3 days before they can actually vote on it. They're just barely making that timeline. So there's likely going to be a lot that happens at the state level between now and final budget adoption in the end of June. But we do start to see a little more clarity from the Senate and the Assembly side. They do both in the identical Assembly and Senate bills fund the COLA at 8.22%, but they are projecting some higher revenue in their projections, which is what allows them to do less of the clawback of the one-time dollars. So our staff will continue to digest that information that we get from our consultants and state level agencies and continue to inform our practices. With that, why don't we open it up for questions, concerns, or even general thoughts? Susan, I see you have your hand up. We'll start with you. Thank you.
Very nice presentation, James. Well done. I have two questions. You mentioned several times about the Educator Effectiveness Grant of $4.6 million. Help me understand what that is. And the second question is, you made there were several references about contributions to rising costs in NPA and NPS for special ed. Help me understand those two, please. Thank
Sure.
you.
So the NPA, NPS cost, and Danny could chime in as well. I talked to him about this morning. Ultimately, sometimes we have to outsource specific services for special education to non-public agencies or non-public schools in order to get those services provided for our students. And so those are those rising costs that we see for special education. And one of the, I guess, main reasons why we do see contributions increasing year over year. And then
James, if I could just add to that, James, the NPA, NPS costs that we see are for students who have needs that are more intensive than we can generally provide within our own school setting within FUSD. So these might be students who have a need for residential treatment as part of their IEP. It might be students who have a need for a more specialized service. It also may be places where we don't have enough staff internally, let's say speech and language, occupational therapy, physical therapy, or we might need to contract out for services. So all of these services and or placements are part of a student's IEP plan. And some are residential, some are just non-public schools that might require a higher level of intensive support than we provide here within Fremont. So James, if you want to carry forward with the other part of that question.
Thank you.
The Educator Effectiveness Grant, it's a one-time funding provided to school districts to provide professional learning for teachers, administrators, paraprofessionals, and classified staff in order to promote educator equity, quality, and effectiveness. So ultimately, that is run from the program side of our departments at for our Educator Effectiveness Grant.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. And I see Trustee Jones.
Yeah, a couple of things, and some of this is in my Q&A, but I think I'd like some of it discussed here. Is there, was there something different about the timing this year? Because usually at the proposed budget, we have already incorporated the May revise, and I know this time we haven't. So I'm wondering what was different about the timing that made it so we couldn't do that this go?
Sure. Yeah, the main complexities this year compared to the prior years was mainly due to the state-funded COLA tying directly into our salary raises for 23-24. And so we start the adopted budget process in March. And so one of the steps in the process early on, and this takes place like around April, is we have to create a salary model. And that salary model, we didn't have the 8.22% at the time. We only had the 8.13% at the time. So the adopted budget process is actually a several months process. And so, we had to go with the 8.13% at the time, but also, there's been talks around the state. We weren't really sure where the COLA was going to land outside of the 8.13%, if it was going to go up, if it was going to go down, if it was going to go to 8.22%, or if that 8.22% was even going to be state funded. So there was a lot of things just hanging in the air. So we decided to go conservative and just go with the 8.13% and tie it to our salary model and make sure all of our salaries are tied to an increase of 8.13%. But that doesn't stop us from revising the budget at 45-day and adding in the additional 0.09% for our raises and our revenues.
Is there any way that we could incorporate? I mean, I don't know what this is like, so I'm asking you, because my ideas of what are possible sometimes are not realistic. Is there any way to make this change before the final adoption at the second meeting in June? I'm just a little hesitant to approve a budget that doesn't incorporate the May revised numbers, and I'm wondering what chance is there that we could actually get this updated before the final adoption?
I'll be honest with you, slim to none, and that's mainly because for every piece of resource, like we have so many resources across Fremont Unified, and we'd have to rebalance every resource to revenues and expenditures. And so that's a really lengthy process. It actually takes months to do. And that's why we have to do our salary model, in April. That way we have enough ample time to pull together a budget. But all that to say, the 0.09%, the salary increase, we're projecting it to just be a difference of $300,000. So it's not a lot across all of the, the whole district, across all resources, unrestricted, restricted. It's only $300,000. That's something we could definitely afford. And we put that into the ending balance for our unrestricted general fund, plus the additional revenue, which we did not budget. If we add in the 0.09% difference in LCFF revenue, that alone is $2.4 million. So all that to say, we're pretty confident that we'll be okay to afford the raise.
Okay, and so what we're seeing reflects those numbers just in a different way. So the proposed budget and the budget we're going to be adopting in June at the second June meeting is going to reflect those numbers, just not budgeted in the way that we have in the past, but it is reflecting the additional revenue and the additional expenses for the raises. I see Mr. Hillman nodding.
Yeah, I was going to say that it's very similar to how things were reflected last year when at adopted budget, the district had, and it was before my time, but I could see from the outside when I came to analyze the numbers, that in the ending fund balance, there was money set aside for negotiating raises, and they hadn't all been landed yet, but we pretty much knew at that point kind of what the lay of the land was going to be. So those dollars were earmarked. James and his team have already done that for this difference between 8.13 and 8.22, and then the subsequent raise 713 and 722. So it's already there. So if you look at the top line of how much money the district is getting and how much money will be left at the bottom, it's all accounted for, as you said, very similar to how it was done last year, just with smaller dollar amounts.
Okay. And then the staffing allocations on slide 20 for CNS, I know because we're now doing universal meals. Are those allocations sufficient to meet the need? And I know we always need more staffing, even when we need more people everywhere, but I'm wondering, is that going to be sufficient to take care of what we need to do?
In short, yes. Been working with Director Vanderpool on this, and there's actually a couple of additional positions that we're going to bring forward, or he's bringing forward. But yes, the idea behind the additional staffing across Fund 13, which is child nutrition, is to make sure that they have enough staffing to do the scratch cooking for the amount of students who are asking for meals. So all of the numbers across the district are higher than they used to be. And the numbers in some places are double or even triple. They're really amazing, great numbers. It allows the whole program to be self-sufficient, as James said, with no contribution from the general fund for Fund 13, which is wonderful. And the additional staffing will allow us to do some of the things that the state wants us to do, primarily scratch cooking. And we'll also be able to tie scratch cooking with some of the menu things that our community and our kids are asking for. So yes, it will take us a very large leap from where we've been to where we want to end up. Okay.
Also, I noticed that we, I think it's slide 27, we're looking at budgeting for like 1% inflation. And I noticed somewhere else, I don't know whether it was in the book or another place in the presentation, like that included 1% for like utilities costs and stuff. And given what we've seen with inflation the last couple of years, I'm feeling uncomfortable with only a 1% budgeting for inflation. Is that realistic?
I think right now we'll definitely monitor that very closely. We projected about a 1% increase, and what we're going to do is just really monitor our departments and our school sites very closely to stay within their budget. We allocated a budget. We provided a 1% increase for inflation for materials and supplies, but we'll definitely do our best to monitor it and keep the board in the loop.
I mean, if it was more like what we've seen in the last couple of years, would our budget be able to, absorb that? Like if we saw like 4 or 5% inflation with utilities and supplies, could we absorb that? I'm just, 1% seems awfully low.
I mean, in short, yes, we can absorb it. We would move some things around like we always do. We are constantly monitoring this. It's a good reminder that the budget is never a static item. You never want it to just be great. You stamped it and now we don't touch it for 6 months. That's never happening. It's being adjusted and tweaked here and there on a monthly basis. That's what the whole team's job is to do. So if we see something coming in higher and something coming in lower, we can make it work out, and that's what the team will do. I think that we went with a very low inflation rate because that inflation, when you type it into the system, goes across all categories, and we're not seeing the consistent, persistent inflation across every single category. And so we want to see how it shakes out. Things are better than they were 12 months ago, and certain industries and sectors are coming in a little bit cheaper. There are certain things that aren't coming down. Construction costs is one of those, for instance, but that doesn't really affect any of the things that James's model is predicting. Most of what his model's coming in at is if what you bought from Amazon last year, you want to buy it again, paper and pencils and things like that. Is all of that going to increase by more than 1%? Maybe not. Maybe it does. If it starts coming in hot at first interim, we can make an adjustment, but I don't think it's going to come in. Given the way the economy is looking, I don't expect it to continue to increase. I would expect it to flatline, maybe start to come down a little bit. So that's why we chose that number.
Okay, and just one last question, and this is more of a comment than a question, really. I know a lot of what we're doing to adjust to declining enrollment is staffing reductions that right size the district. And I think I've mentioned this elsewhere. I want to make sure we have a discussion somewhere, whether it's this committee or another committee or at the board level, about our staffing ratios, because there are some things that we don't want to fall below a certain level, regardless of, say, a school size. Like, we would never get rid of the admin, right? You need a principal, whether your school is 200 students or 1,000 students. You need a secretary, whether your school is 200 or 1,000. A lot of our staffing ratios were set at a time when we were projecting increased enrollment that saw no end. And the only implications were ever going to be to increase those staffing ratios. And I think there are certain kinds of positions that we need to have a deeper discussion about. I mean, since this has already been discussed at a board meeting, I'm concerned about our libraries. I don't think it's okay for those to be closed some days, regardless of the size of the school. That's just me. But I think we need to have a deeper discussion about some of these staffing ratios before we decide, okay, this is how we're handling declining enrollment, period. Because there may be some positions that we want to protect, meaning that we would have to look at other reductions. And I'm wondering where we would have those kinds of discussions.
Thanks, Trustee Jones. And what we can do is we can continue to talk about those. We can, at the direction of the board, craft an agenda item to talk about staffing ratios as a whole. But for context for this conversation, what we're doing right now with right sizing our staffing, if it were something like library positions, the LMTs, for example, that would constitute a classified reduction, which would need to come from the board for action. So there would always be a process by which the board is involved in those staffing adjustments. Where we're right sizing the majority of our staffing right now is where we see natural attrition, natural occurrences. Examples might include if we don't have the right amount of students for a classroom, we're going to surplus a teacher from one school site to fill a vacancy at another school site. And so that movement of staff within the district and hiring less staff. So even though we were in declining enrollment last year, I think we hired roughly 120 new teachers. So we expect that number to be dramatically lower this year in terms of how many we hire, because on an average year, we're retiring or resigning in a number of teachers somewhere around 120 to 140. And so it's really just taking those opportunities where an elementary school might be, as I think was in James' presentation, we added FTE at the middle school conversion sites. decreased FTE at elementary sites. And I think the net decrease in classroom positions was somewhere around 20. And so those are really the things that we're doing right now. Other than those naturally occurring staffing adjustments, the only one that we've brought forward is the library media technicians, which was part of an existing staffing formula, and the board expressed their desire to not make that change in the current time. So any other adjustments we make beyond just adjusting enrollment for certificated staffing would have to come forward to the board. And I see Michelle's hand. Michelle, please go ahead.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Mhm.
Hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Hi, sorry. I'm kind of juggling two pieces of technology. First of all, transportation, and I have to apologize because I was in the car and now I'm in my house trying to go through everything. But you mentioned transportation costs, which kind of piqued my ear, and I looked at it very quickly and then it went off. I'd kind of like to go through that again very quickly. In that my understanding was that what we were spending on buses was coming through a grant, so that there shouldn't be a net cost to us. Has that changed?
For transportation costs in the ending fund balance that we set aside.
Yeah.
Oh, so we did set aside additional dollars. Any fleets that we need to replace, we just want to make sure we have set aside dollars for those expenses. If a van, goes kaput and we need to replace it, or anything of that nature, we want to make sure we have sufficient dollars in our ending fund balance or our savings account to make sure that we could fund those liabilities that could potentially occur in the middle of the year. So it's
And we still are looking at grants, Michelle. For example, we just had a board agenda item for the Carl Moyer grants for buses, but we also just recently had an agenda item. I think it was around $108,000. I think was the price for a van that had a wheelchair lift for transportation. So some of them are expenditures that we would be making, and some of them are grant funded bus acquisitions. It would be a combination of both.
So we're looking at bus, but we're also looking at we're looking at both yellow and white fleet, is what you're saying. Okay. Thank you. I thank you for the clarification on that. I want to concur with Trustee Jones about the 1% inflation. That's kind of a concern, being a supply clerk and looking at the prices and how much they have changed, and what I started with, what I thought I could buy, and what I ended up actually buying are two different things. And so it's one thing to say everyone has to look at their budgets and watch their budgets closely, but it's difficult to do when you're told here's $20, but now everything costs 40. Right. And so I'm very concerned about that. The schools themselves have such a they get very few dollars to begin with, and then it's squeezing it so hard that we're ending up with turnips and nothing else. So that's a red flag for me. Being on the front line on that. Now speaking, I can't leave this meeting without speaking as an SEIU member, because everyone's going to ask me that. We know what the COLA is. As I keep cautioning everything, it's based on the funded COLA. We believe that the funded COLA is, as it is right now, will go through, and whether it's 8.13 or the 8.22, that's we're not going to argue about that. But if it's based on 8.13, then we would be looking at a 7.13% increase, correct?
Right.
Yes, that's correct, Michelle. Right now, both the governor's proposal that we have seen and the one that was just announced today by the Senate and the Assembly, both of those are slated to fund the state COLA at 8.22%. if it is funded at 8.22%, the negotiated agreements we have with all bargaining units and with our managers would be the state funded COLA of 8.22% less 1%. So it would mean that effective July 1st, our salary schedules would be increased by 7.22%. Now,
Okay.
we won't know definitively what that actual number is until the state gives us the final approval and the final votes. But right now, what we're hearing is that they're planning on fully funding the COLA at 8.22%.
So if it is funded, fully funded 8.22%, and I realize, James, you've got money split up, to cover that. Would that mean that the 8.22 or whatever the funded amount is minus the 1%, that net amount would be on the July 31st, August 1st check?
In
So
short, yes.
Yeah, we'll be sending out a letter to employees once we know the final state budget, but that is our intent, is to have everybody's check reflect the new increased amount of 7.22%, pending the state funded COLA being fully funded at the end of July's check.
Okay, so and we'll know that by June 30th, because if we don't have a state budget signed, everyone's stops work. Well,
Yes.
you know what I mean. Okay, and then the other thing was I saw the CNS allocations, and we seem to be moving ahead on that. So appreciate your time. Thank you. Good presentation.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.
So we're almost at the 5 o'clock hour. Any other questions from the group before we close out today? If you are thinking of those questions, I'll just advise that if there is a substantial change in the state budget upon approval, we'll certainly keep this group updated. We do have to watch the dotting the I's and crossing the T's of the trailer bill language, which comes along with any budget cycle. Sometimes that has more fiscal implications than any of the things we discussed today. For example, the difference between the 8.13 and the 8.22 might be the smallest discrepancy of any budget amount that we talk about when we actually review the trailer bill language. So we will be keeping our eyes on that, and I'm sure we'll all see the headlines in the next 2 weeks, depending on what happens with negotiations at the state level. With that, it may very well likely be that the next time we come together will be to review the 45-day revision, and that is, as we've highlighted today, where we articulate the changes that we think we will know from the state level. And again, I'm just speculating. I think those will likely be related to where they reach final agreement on the clawback of one-time dollars. And with that, I want to thank everybody for their participation this year. It is always a good year when we're able to have these without actually talking about formal plans for budget reductions. I don't want to say that those days are not out in front of us, but this has been a year that we have not had to do that as it was last year. And we will hope that we can continue with some sound fiscal management and some help from the state and an improved fiscal outlook across the state. And maybe we can have another year of that as well. So thank you, everybody, for participating in this task force. And feel free to tune in on Wednesday if you don't have anything else to do. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for your